Riley Anders was 12 when she first slipped her small hands under the tarp that covered what everyone called a ghost. The old Shelby Cobra sat behind her father's garage, half swallowed by weeds, the once proud paint eaten by rust. Her father, Dean, used to tell her bedtime stories about the races he almost won and the dream car he would one day restore. Those stories stayed alive in Riley's heart long after Dean's back gave out and the garage turned into a tired neighborhood pit stop for pickup trucks and broken lawnmowers. While her friends spent weekends glued to their phones, Riley spent hers sorting bolts and wiping grime off old engine parts. Dean never told her no when she asked to help. He figured it was harmless tinkering, just his little girl playing mechanic. But inside Riley's mind, plans formed like constellations in a midnight sky. Every bolt she polished, every scrap she catalogued, was a step closer to the roar she dreamed of hearing echo through the neighborhood again. She'd sneak outside after dinner, flashlight balanced on her shoulder, scribbling notes into an old spiral notebook. One Friday evening in March, Dean fell asleep watching old races on VHS tapes. His tired hands wrapped around a lukewarm mug of coffee, Riley tiptoed into the garage and lifted the tarp again. She traced her fingers along the battered hood and whispered to it like she was comforting an old friend. She lifted the hood and saw the mess of wires, the empty spaces where cylinders once breathed life into metal. She didn't see a graveyard. She saw a puzzle, and she loved puzzles more than anything. Riley saved every dollar she got from sweeping the garage floors and running errands for neighbors. She traded her birthday gifts for tool sets and spent hours online watching videos of backyard mechanics rebuilding classics from junk. At school, when teachers called on her, she'd jerk awake from daydreams about compression ratios and valve timings. Her mother had left when Riley was just a baby. Sometimes the other kids made fun of her. Hand-me-down clothes, the grease stains under her fingernails. But when the school day ended, Riley rushed home to her sanctuary of gears and blueprints. By summer break, she knew the Shelby Cobra manual by heart. She snuck it from Dean's locked drawer and read it under her blanket with a flashlight. Every bolt size, torque spec and diagram lived in her mind like a secret code. Dean noticed her dirty fingernails and the growing collection of parts under her bed, but he didn't have the heart to tell her it was hopeless. He didn't. No, she'd been scavenging junkyards, trading her lunch money for rusted carburetors and broken camshafts she thought she could resurrect. One sweltering afternoon, a shiny black SUV rolled up to the garage. Riley wiped sweat from her brow as a man stepped out in an expensive suit and polished shoes that didn't belong on cracked concrete. It was Radley, a local millionaire who collected vintage cars like trophies. He'd once offered Dean a small fortune to buy the Cobra's carcass for parts. Dean turned him down back then. Pride cost him plenty, but he kept the dream. Miles looked at the girl, the tarp half dragged. Aside, the old frame exposed like a secret she wasn't ready to share. Miles smirked as Dean walked out, embarrassed and apologizing for the mess. "Thought you'd have scrapped this by now," Miles said, tapping the Cobra's dented fender with a manicured knuckle. Riley narrowed her eyes, but stayed silent. She stood her ground, hands tucked into her two big work gloves, the heat shimmering off the metal between them. Miles tilted his sunglasses down and glanced at Dean. "You letting her play pretend?" he asked. Dean shifted his feet and laughed weakly. "She's just having fun," he said, but inside a quiet spark of hope flickered. That night, Riley couldn't sleep. She sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, the old manual open beside a notebook full of her sketches. She flipped pages back and forth, tracing wiring diagrams, writing parts lists she could barely afford in her wildest dreams. She circled mistakes, underlined ideas, and scribbled reminders to double-check tolerances. She heard her father's soft snore through the thin wall. She wished she could tell him her plan, but feared he'd laugh, or worse, he'd look at her with pity. She didn't want pity. She wanted the Cobra's engine to sing. By September, she'd traded half her wardrobe for old alternators and busted pistons. She biked miles to junkyards, digging through rust piles with gloves 2 sizes too big. She learned to smooth scratches with sandpaper and polish corrosion until the parts shone like tiny, buried treasures. When Dean found her out back once, sleeves rolled up, head buried in the Cobra's engine bay, he froze. She expected him to shout, but he didn't. He just watched her for a long moment, then turned and walked back inside. That night he left a fresh set of wrenches on her workbench. Winter came early that year. Cold crept through the garage's thin walls, and Riley's breath fogged the air as she worked late. Into the night, she wore her father's old flannel, sleeves rolled up over thermal gloves. She cut her knuckles more times than she could count, wrapping them in duct tape when the bandages ran out. She whispered to the engine when the cold made the metal creak. She promised it a new heart, a new voice, and a new chance to fly. Some nights she cried quietly, but she never once thought about quitting. One morning she found Dean leaning over her notes. He had a mug in hand, steam curling around his tired eyes. He didn't say a word, just pointed to a line she'd calculated wrong. She laughed and erased it. For the first time in years, they worked together. He taught her how to listen for misfires, how to feel for heat in a block, how to trust her instincts when the numbers didn't add up. When neighbors came to drop off their busted lawnmowers, they'd hear the two of them arguing over timing belts like old friends. By spring, the Cobra's frame looked alive again. Old paint chips replaced with primer, panels sanded smooth. A local salvage yard owner, amused by Riley's stubbornness, gave her a cracked carburetor for free. She fixed it with borrowed tools, tested it on Dean's dusty pickup first, then fitted it into the Cobra's reborn heart. At night, she dreamed of that first ignition, the roar that would prove every kid at school wrong, every neighbor who chuckled behind her back, every grown man who told her, "That's cute, honey," when she spoke about horsepower and torque. When Miles returned that May, he didn't expect to see real progress. He stepped out of his Escalade, expensive shoes crunching gravel, and froze when he saw the garage lights burning bright even, though the sun was setting. Inside, Riley stood on tiptoes, tightening bolts with a torque wrench bigger than her forearm. Dean leaned beside her, handing her tools without saying a word. Miles's two mechanics, grizzled men who'd spent decades fine-tuning million-dollar classics, peeked over his shoulder, then laughed, until Riley fired up her battered laptop and showed them her custom ECU maps. They fell silent, then asked her polite questions. She answered every one, without looking up from her work. When Miles tried to offer her a check, enough money to buy new clothes, new tools, maybe even her own little shop, she wiped her greasy hands on her father's old racing jacket and smiled. "I'm not done yet," she said. Miles opened his mouth, closed it, then stepped back into his SUV, the laughter gone from his eyes. For the first time, he didn't see a mechanic's kid. He saw a builder, a problem solver, a threat to his easy world. That night, as thunder rolled across the town, Riley lay awake listening to the rain ping against the tin roof. She pictured herself behind the wheel, her father, cheering from the bleachers, the Cobra's engine roaring under her feet like a beast. Come alive. She fell asleep with her palms still stained black, the old manual open beside her like a trusted friend. And outside, under the tarp that no longer hid a ghost but a promise, the Shelby Cobra waited for its second chance. June arrived with restless winds and long days that pushed Riley harder than ever. By now, neighbors stopped by to drop off small parts, old spark plugs, even lawnmower, engines she could strip for pieces. Dean's hands trembled when he worked too long, but he stayed by her side, handing her tools, steadying wires as she soldered connections smaller than her thumb. Some nights she passed out on the cold garage floor, grease on her cheeks, head resting against the Cobra's door. She woke up, smiling, arms stiff but spirit unbroken, dreams humming through her veins like fuel. She knew she couldn't keep hiding the project forever. One evening, when Dean was out getting imparts, Riley opened her phone and filmed a short clip. No filters, no fancy edits, just her, the Cobra's gutted interior behind her, her hands covered in grime. She spoke softly but clearly, explaining how she'd rebuilt the manifold, how she'd used second-hand pistons, how she still needed a transmission that fit. She posted it online with a caption, "A girl, her dad's dream. In Dakar, no one believes can run again." Then she forgot about it, too busy to care. By the next morning, the video had 50 views. By that night, it had thousands. Strangers left comments with advice, encouragement, some even offering to mail her parts they didn't need. One woman in Michigan promised to ship her a gearbox if Riley could pay shipping. Riley laughed and showed Dean, who nearly spilled his coffee when he saw the numbers climb. He didn't say much, but that night he whispered to the empty Cobra when Riley couldn't hear. He thanked it for giving his daughter hope, for giving him back a reason to stay standing. By mid-July, local news crews came by, curious about the kid mechanic bringing a ghost car back to life in her backyard. Cameras rolled as Riley explained how she scavenged parts, how she double-checked every torque spec, how she refused to give up. Dean stood beside her, quiet but beaming with pride. A few of the same kids who mocked her at school suddenly wanted selfies with the Cobra's dusty hood. Riley let them see inside, but never let them touch. Some dreams are too delicate to risk on people who never believed you could fly. One afternoon, Miles Radley pulled up again, this time bringing along two of his master mechanics, Hank and Eddie, legends in the local classic car scene. They watched her work in silence at first, arms folded, sunglasses hiding their eyes. But when she fired up the laptop again, showing them her wiring diagrams, her mapped fuel curves, they leaned in closer, nodding slowly. Hank offered her an internship on the spot. Eddie laughed and asked if she'd consider building engines for his private collection someday. Riley just smiled, thanked them politely, then crawled back under the Cobra's frame. They stood there, speechless, while Dean sipped his coffee and pretended not to grin. Miles looked around at the crowd gathering on the cracked driveway. Neighbors, old men with folded arms, kids on bikes, everyone waiting for the ghost to roar back to life. He slipped Dean a business card on his way out. "When she's ready, call me," he said. Dean took it but never promised a thing. Later that night, he tossed the card into an old coffee can full of mismatched screws. Riley didn't want to work for Miles. She wanted to finish what she'd started. August brought storms that rattled the garage door and sent water dripping from the roof. Riley didn't care. She patched leaks with duct tape, spread tarps over tools, and kept working. One night the wind knocked out the power, plunging the garage into pitch black. She lit a camping lantern, propped it on the old tool chest, and kept tightening bolts by hand. Her fingers ached from cold and effort, but when Dean came to check on her, she just grinned through chattering teeth. "Almost." "There," she whispered, her breath a ghost in the lantern's soft glow. A week later, Dean found a note taped to the kitchen fridge. "Be back soon, don't worry." Riley had biked 7 miles to a junkyard at dawn, following a rumor about an old transmission that might fit. She haggled with the owner, offering her last $20 plus 3 hours of sweeping floors. She dragged the transmission onto a borrowed wagon and pulled it all the way home. Dean heard the squeaky wheels before he saw her, sweat dripping down her nose, grinning like she'd won the lottery. He didn't scold her, he helped her drag it inside. September arrived with clear skies and the first hints of autumn. Riley tightened the final bolts with trembling hands, double-checked every connection. She wiped sweat off her forehead and looked at her father, who nodded like a man who'd finally stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. Neighbors gathered in the driveway. Kids perched on bikes, grown men folded arms, old women leaned on walkers. Miles parked at the curb in his black SUV again, the same master, mechanics at his side. They didn't say a word this time. They just watched her crawl behind the wheel. Dean handed her the keys. Riley turned them over in her small palm, heart pounding like a drum in her throat. She took a deep breath, whispered something only the Cobra could hear, and slipped the key into the ignition. The click echoed like a starting gun. She pumped the gas once, twice turned the key, and held her breath. For a moment, nothing, then a cough. A rumble, a roar so raw and alive it brought tears to her eyes. The Shelby Cobra's engine stitched together from cast-offs, and Faith thundered to life like it had never died. Neighbors cheered. A few people clapped her father on the back so hard he nearly dropped his coffee. Miles and his mechanics exchanged stunned glances. Dean leaned against the doorframe, shoulders shaking with silent laughter. Riley grinned, wiped tears from her cheek with the back of her oily hand, and revved the engine again. The sound rattled. Windows. It woke up dreams long buried under bills and broken promises. It told every kid on that street that some things were worth fighting for, even if the world told you to give up before you began. After that day, Riley's story traveled further than she ever expected. The local news clip hit national TV. Car magazines begged for interviews. She even got an invitation to showcase the Cobra at a vintage car expo. 2 states away, Dean borrowed an old trailer, and they drove through the night, the Cobra strapped tight, Riley's face pressed to the window as headlights flickered past. At the expo, rows of gleaming classics lined up under bright lights. Grown men in polished shoes scoffed when they saw the battered hood and the girl in her oversized coveralls. Then she lifted the hood and showed them what she'd built. Master mechanics, hobbyists, millionaires with polished watches, all leaned closer, questions spilling from lips that once smirked. Riley answered them all. She spoke the language of torque and timing, compression and combustion. She shook hands that once waved her off like a joke when she turned the key and the engine roared in that pristine hall. Applause echoed so loud she almost didn't hear her father whisper, "Told you it'd run, kiddo." She turned and hugged him, her hands still stained with the truth of her work. Months passed. Offers rolled in, internships, apprenticeships, schools with scholarships Riley could never afford. Otherwise, she read them carefully, pen tapping her chin, her father pretending not to peek over her shoulder. When Miles called again, offering a spot in his private racing team's garage, Riley thanked him kindly but said she had something better in mind. One evening she stood with Dean in the now tidy garage, her father's racing jacket draped over her small shoulders. She pointed at the empty corner. "We can build more here, Dad, for people who don't have a chance." Dean just nodded. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. The Cobra sat in the garage's warm glow, polished but never showroom perfect. It wore its scars proudly, like Riley did. They spent that winter taking small jobs for neighbors, fixing beaters, tuning old trucks, teaching kids who peeked in to see what the noise was about. They saved every penny, poured it back into parts, better tools, a small sign that read, "Anders Custom Engines, built from hope." Riley sometimes caught her father standing in the doorway at dusk, watching her work, like he used to watch races. She never stopped getting her hands dirty. She never traded her boots for fancy shoes or her grease-stained flannels for crisp shirts. And whenever someone asked what she'd do next, she pointed at the Cobra. "Same thing," she'd say, voice steady as an idling engine. "Bring the dead back to life, one piece at a time."